Welcome back to the Savvy Skeptic Psychedelic Forum. Happy New Year to everyone. Happy New Year, Rakesh.
Same to
Um,
you.
what can we look forward to in the world of psychedelic therapies in 2024 now that we're in a new year?
Yes, indeed. And Happy New Year to you and to all of the savvy skeptics out there. Keep that skepticism going. But the good news is 2024 is shaping up to be a banner year for psychedelics because, Katya, we are expecting the approval of MDMA through the MAPS projects, but as I think probably everybody knows by now, MAPS has split into two, and there is now a for-profit branch of MAPS called Lycos. So in the future, we should be looking for Lycos launching what I think will be the world's first approved psychedelic medicine in late 2024. That's a big deal.
That is a really significant event. So if everything goes well, MDMA will be the first psychedelic to gain FDA approval. And during this episode, we will be taking a look at the two seminal studies of MDMA for the treatment of PTSD that comprise that FDA filing. Studies are called MAP1 and MAP2. Rakesh, how is PTSD currently treated and why do we need a new treatment?
Yeah, so I got involved in helping people suffering from PTSD probably from the first day I entered psychiatric training over 3 decades ago because it's common. So it would be incredibly important to establish that PTSD is common and it's close to impossible to escape the impact of PTSD in any culture, in any socioeconomic strata. Men and women, young and old, are all afflicted. So we have a disorder with incredible unmet needs. Now, as a researcher, I became involved in the development of two medications, paroxetine and sertraline. But this is going back almost 25 some years. And the sad news is, despite the passage of that much time, we still only have two medications approved for the treatment of PTSD, that being paroxetine and sertraline. And they're both SSRIs. And the problem is about half, 40 to 60% of patients do not respond to them. And even though we do have effective psychotherapies for quite a few people, not everybody responds to it. We also have a great shortage of clinicians who are trained in these formalized protocols to help people with PTSD. So, quite sadly, there are many people, but particularly those with the dissociative subtype of PTSD, people with a history of childhood trauma, alcohol or substance abuse, they are not being served well at all. So, to circle back to the question you had asked me, do we need a new treatment, a different treatment, a radically interesting treatment for the treatment of PTSD? The answer is a strikingly strong yes.
Yeah, you definitely make a good case for that. Let's remind our listeners how MDMA works. So it's not a classic psychedelic, but really a multimodal one, correct?
It is, Katya. So, a classic psychedelic was defined, and that's changing, by the way, but was defined as any medication or any substance, plant based or otherwise, that worked on the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor as an agonist. That definition is changing rapidly because there's a number of medications that are psychedelics that don't have that mechanism of action. And MDMA is a great example of that. In fact, many people do not think of MDMA as a psychedelic, and that's okay. That's okay. Many of us think of it as a hybrid. It's a psychedelic sometimes, it's an empathogen, it's an entactogen, all things that you and I have covered in previous podcasts or video casts as we're doing now. So, what is MDMA? And what MDMA is, it's a mix really of multiple mechanisms of action. So, it does have a stimulant effect to it, but at the same time, because it forces the presynaptic neuron to release a substantial amount, literally a flood of serotonin, norepinephrine, and actually even oxytocin into the synaptic cleft. It works as a uniquely different molecule with its own distinct signature. And it is so unique that I actually am hard pressed to think of another psychedelic that works through that mechanism of action.
So, and animal data have shown us that MDMA can actually help extinguish fearful memories, as well as allow them to be reconsolidated or reformed. It also promotes social behavior. In humans, we've known that in fMRI studies, it's able to reduce amygdala activity to fearful stimuli. So before we get to the results of the studies, can you tell us why there are two of them in this NDA filing, Rakesh?
Yeah, so glad you talked about the neurobiology of PTSD because PTSD, in some ways, is really a disorder of memory. But it is, if you will, a disorder of improperly, abnormally, or painfully consolidated memories in our cortex. And when we go into a deeper dive, it's not just a matter of the cortex, it's much more the amygdala, as you mentioned.
Mhm.
The fear response is an excessive one, but there's also a problem with the processing of the memory. So, what people do with PTSD is they have a major trauma, and instead of being able to process it biologically, it gets consolidated in a negative fashion. And then the person learns not to retrieve that memory in order to process it. They learn to actually protect it. The only problem is such memory has a very bad habit of exploding out at just the wrong time. That's why in PTSD, you have two sets of symptoms: the active symptoms or the positive symptoms of flashbacks and nightmares and startle response, but also the negative set of symptoms, which tend to be withdrawal or the negative affect that people have. And that's why MDMA is so interesting. But coming back to what you asked, why do we have two studies? And the reason is quite simply FDA, thank goodness, demands that if you do have an effective intervention, prove it at least twice. Because sometimes you can have one positive study and then the future studies don't show that result. So, in order to protect the public from an ineffective drug, the FDA does have an appropriate demand to have two different studies. So, with MDMA, what MAPS decided to do now, Lycos, they have two separate studies. They are both what we would call phase 3 studies. They have a pretty similar structure, which is 3 sessions of MDMA therapy with preparation work. So there's substantial amount of psychotherapy that happens even before they come to MDMA. And there's quite a bit of psychotherapy that happens even after they receive MDMA or placebo. And in MAPS 1, the patients were typically in the severe category. In MAPS 2, it was more combination. So about a fourth of the patients actually had moderate, and about three-fourths of the patients had more severe PTSD. And I would like to note that about 50% of participants in MAPS 2 were non-whites. And that's a cardinally important
That's
aspect of that
incredible.
study. Yeah, because PTSD, while it is truly non-discriminatory, it affects every race there is, Katia, but the Black population and the Latina population are more susceptible to PTSD for a whole bunch of psychosocial and perhaps even biological reasons. So to have a study where 50% of people were in that vulnerable category just increases our confidence that the study is clinically meaningful.
That's a great explanation. And obviously, we want a medication or an upcoming medication to be generalizable to everyone, to be for everyone. And for that, everyone needs to be represented in the trial. I also think it's really interesting what you pointed out about the negative symptoms of PTSD. I don't know if people are in the habit of thinking of it that way yet, but I think it's really interesting, especially given the results of the two trials. Now looking at the primary endpoint in MAP1. So they studied MDMA plus therapy compared with placebo plus therapy and found that MDMA plus therapy significantly reduced PTSD symptoms measured with a CAPS-5 scale at 18 weeks. And what's really notable is that the effect size was a very, very large. The between group effect size for MDMA plus therapy was about 0.9. The largest effect size of SSRIs used to treat PTSD is about 0.6. And then the within group effect size for the MDMA group was 2.1 compared to 1.2 for placebo plus therapy. Now, what about MAP2?
Wow, Katya, just listening to you describe the results of the study just astounds me. Because these are not just, if you will, the garden variety PTSD afflicted individuals. These are often folks who have tried other therapies. In fact, most of them had already tried not just one, but multiple other therapies. And even then, MDMA plus psychotherapy very handily beats psychotherapy plus placebo. It's the most astonishing finding. We should also remind ourselves that the greatest separation did not happen at month 1, or I should say treatment 1 or treatment 2, but treatment 3. So it's something about MDMA that seems to feed on its previous success. But the numbers you're describing, the effect sizes are simply astounding. I did the sertraline and paroxetine trials, and while we did see a few people get better, it was nothing like this. And in MAPS 2, which, as I shared with you before, is a very similarly designed study with same doses, but the population that was different, so more diverse population. And when the population gets diverse, you would expect the results to also perhaps shift, and that's exactly what happened. So MDMA plus therapy did quite statistically significantly improve symptoms of PTSD as compared to placebo plus therapy, with a between group effect size difference of 0.7, which is really large, really large.
Very large.
Yeah, especially when you keep in mind the diversity of the population, the severity of the population, and also the fact they had tried. Most of them had tried medications before, and within group effect was a stratospheric 1.95. So the lower effect in MAPS2 should not dissuade any of us savvy skeptics from saying, that was not as significant. It is wildly significant. And I do think, Katya, that the two studies that we're describing today, which I believe are in the public domain for any of our readers to themselves read in the entirety, including the appendix sections. Both studies have a very robust supplementary section. It changes even the greatest of skeptics' minds to at least give MDMA a pretty significant closer look in this population, which has been classically very difficult to study. And it's a population that's also very impaired.
Yeah, I mean, the effect sizes are huge. We're not used to seeing that in psychiatry trials, right? What about day-to-day functioning? Did MDMA improve functioning as well?
Yeah, so I've always complimented the savvy skeptics who we are addressing today for perhaps not just buying the notion that reducing symptoms of a disorder is sufficient. It's not. Because one could make the argument, well, they got MDMA, they felt very joyous. Of course, they're going to say they are not, their symptoms are better. But if functionality is improved, especially when you keep in mind that these folks only had 3 treatments in 3 months, and each MDMA session biologically did not last more than 6 to 8 hours. And the results that you and I are about to present to our colleagues is overwhelmingly impressive. So the Sheehan Disability Scale, which is the gold standard, if not the platinum standard scale used in psychiatric trials to see how well a patient's actually functioning in areas of work or school, or in areas of home functioning, or in areas of social functioning, or all three. I have really good news that both of the studies demonstrated that the actual functionality of these patients with PTSD, who are almost always gravely dysfunctional, is positive. And the illustration that we're showing our colleagues should really make the point that MDMA does not appear to be just a symptom controller. It's not the Tylenol of reducing fever. It actually seems to be corrective of the disorder and also to improve functionality.
Yeah. It also seems to make the disorder go away in a large number of people. So in MAP 1, 67% of the people in the MDMA plus therapy group no longer had PTSD at 18 months, according to DSM criteria, compared with 32% of people in the placebo group. And these are people who are getting therapy as well. And 33% in the MDMA group versus 5% in the placebo group were just in remission at the end of the study. And similarly, in MAP 2, 71% of people in the MDMA plus therapy group no longer met criteria for PTSD at all, compared with 48% in the placebo group. And 46% in the MDMA group were in remission, compared to about 21% in the placebo group, which I think is just astounding, because these are people who are also getting therapy, and over and above that, they're still separating.
That is so true. Maybe the 2 points we could make is, number one, therapy is effective.
Mm-hmm.
So what the MAPS trials showed us is that the underuse of psychotherapy, particularly formalized therapy directed towards PTSD, the underutilization of those therapies in America is a gross travesty of justice. We have to find a way to get more people psychotherapy, because you can see psychotherapy itself is actually quite effective in eradicating PTSD. But it clearly does not help the majority of people. But if MDMA is added to the psychotherapy, and remember, it's not a daily treatment, it is one time a month for 3 months and then stop. Just look at the astoundingly greater effectiveness of psychotherapy. And on top of that, Katya, MDMA-assisted therapy worked in every subgroup at risk for treatment resistance. So as I shared before with you, that our SSRIs, SNRIs don't work well for certain subgroups of people. People like dissociative PTSD, people with comorbidities with substance and alcohol misuse, those with childhood trauma, and those who are more severe, and those who have more chronic PTSD. That, however, did not happen with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So it may be a good idea to think of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as an intervention for all kinds of individuals with PTSD, even those who classically haven't responded to treatment before.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, and we're going to talk a little bit about how therapy and MDMA can work together to really help people. I'm sure our savvy skeptics are wondering what the adverse events were like with MDMA. Most adverse events that were more common in the MDMA group were really mild to moderate and transient, and they included muscle tightness, decreased appetite, hyperhidrosis, and feeling cold. There were some transient increases in pulse and blood pressure, and some people experienced some palpitations with MDMA, so that's important to note. We should also talk about suicidal ideation and behavior. These were not increased with MDMA, and they did not exceed baseline rates, but they were observed. But what's really important to note is that in this population of people with PTSD, particularly severe PTSD, who have failed other treatments, the risk of suicidal behavior and ideation is incredibly high at study entry. One important thing to remember about these studies that they looked at MDMA plus therapy, not MDMA alone, as we were saying. So I wanted to ask you, as someone who does therapy with people with PTSD and who has done it for a long time, can you talk a little bit about how we think MDMA may be able to help therapy work better?
Yeah, what a great question you ask. If we're seeing these incredibly high numbers of just adding MDMA to very good psychotherapy, one then has to ask the logical question, exactly why does that happen? So two really important things to remember: that people who have had PTSD have learned to defend themselves very well. Sometimes so much so that they themselves aren't aware of how much they quote unquote hide from themselves,
Mhm.
how much of their pain, how much of their trauma. They don't even allow their minds to recite it to themselves. They've learned to create these boundaries, these fences. And what MDMA does is lowers those boundaries. Also, what happens in PTSD is a great distrust of everybody, including your therapists. You can't help it. But when an individual is on MDMA, there is a beautiful lowering of the defenses and a greater enhancement in bonding. And human bonding is so much more than simply transactional, it's a very internal feeling. So it's hypothesized that because because MDMA acutely and significantly elevates oxytocin, which is often thought of as a bonding or a
Mhm.
love generating, a connection generating neurotransmitter, the confidence and the connection between the therapist and the patient during the session is enhanced to the point that it is curative. Now, the best thing, Katya, is these effects persist even after the MDMA has left the system. In fact, it can persist often for a lifetime. So that's how we think with very good confidence how MDMA is actually acting as a catalyst for psychotherapy. There are patients who have said to me that to be on MDMA is to receive 10 years of psychotherapy in 6 years, and it can be persistent.
Wow.
Now, your question, yeah, it can be very profound. And I am not someone who's too easily impressed by um, patient reports. But when you hear these things over and over and over again, even these greatest skeptic in me has to start admitting maybe I need to lower my skepticism and appreciate that this is actually what happens and this is why people get better. Now, your question was, do we really need psychotherapy? And that's an unanswered question. Right now, it was in the MAPS program, it was always combined with psychotherapy. MDMA was always combined. So I'm not able to answer the question, what would happen if MDMA was given all by itself? That's a question that we will have to address with future phase 4 studies where potentially we will give people MDMA when they have PTSD without combining with psychotherapy. But for today's conversation and for the 2024 conversation, we may want to appreciate that FDA will be granting an indication for MDMA, I predict, not by itself, but in combination with psychotherapy.
That is an incredible explanation. And what I want to leave our listeners with is really the sense of need in this community, because these are people who have tried uh, multiple different things, who have maybe dropped out of therapy, dropped out of pharmacological treatment programs, who may or may not have substance abuse, who may or may not have dissociation, have trauma, um, may have a high rate of suicidal ideation and even behavior. So for these people who have not really had tools that can help them, it's pretty significant. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And stay tuned for the next episode where we are going to look at another interesting development in the psychedelic world in 2024. We're going to look at a trial of psilocybin for major depressive disorder. So thank you, Savvy Skeptics.